Welcome to what is hopefully a new series called Couchside Chats, where I explain how to combat problems that I have faced with my aquarium. Now, these little chats are mostly pretty common information. Some things you may disagree with. These are just simply how I solve my problems. On this Couchside Chat, I would like to take a deep dive into what exactly is required to bring an LPS coral back from the brink. Now, I've had many LPS coral die on me. I am not the best keeper in the world, that's for sure. But I have managed to save quite a few using these following steps. It's a pretty proven method, and one that I use while working at an aquarium store for a few years as well. So what does an unhealthy LPS coral, or large polyp stony coral, really look like? Well, there are a few common indicators for something like that. The most common one that I have faced is a very thin film algae beginning to develop on the skeleton of the coral itself. Now, this can also look like the coral retracting its big fleshy tissues tight against the skeleton, but what I'm talking about is the skeleton being actually exposed and a very thin green algae filming over the tip of the skeleton. That is normally pretty bad, and for large single polyp corals such as Acanthophilia, Scalemia, it's not great news. Cinerina especially. Those guys, when they get the algae on their skeleton, it's not quite as big of a death sentence as Goniopora, well, certain types, but it certainly will take a long time to recover from that. Now, it is true that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. This has been said many times by many different people, but sometimes when you're a newer hobbyist, you don't exactly know what the ounce of prevention looks like. Well, there are a couple of things to look out for as far as large polyp stony corals are concerned. You don't really want to have any alkalinity swings. Now, as far as large polyp stony corals are concerned, you can have them, but if you ignore it for too long and your alkalinity either becomes very high, such as 15, 16, those are very dangerous levels, or too low, such as the low 6s, those are also dangerous levels, and you'll start to see perhaps some polyp bailout, which is when the top, the fleshy part of the polyp, flies away from the skeleton and all you're left with is a white stalk with no fluffy top. Now, another thing to look out for is overdoing things, and by overdoing things I mean lighting and flow. And for most corals, if you underdo it, you will be just fine, perhaps a little bit less growth than you would like, perhaps a little bit less color than you would like, but if you were to overdo things, there is when you get into disastrous consequences. I am of course talking about light. Now, too much light can be very dangerous for a coral. It can cause them to expel their symbiotic dinoflagellate called zooxanthellae, and it'll cause them to bleach out. Not fun. In extreme cases, it will cause them to, in a way, melt. Now, as far as the flow goes, flow is another really important issue. You want to position your power heads in a way that allow them to not directly hit any of your coral. Now, I'll show in an example of how some large polyp stony corals known as frog spawn are gently flowing in the current of the tank. That is because the power head is not directly pointed towards the frog spawn, and you can see a very gentle flow. One little thing that I've really taken to heart after learning this the hard way from the retail side of things when I used to work for an aquarium store is that the spring, the late spring, and the earlier fall are the perfect time for coral. It is that time where you have temperatures of around mid-70s and that is the ideal temperature for your water. Now, what I've found when things have been shipped during the middle of the summer, or perhaps the middle of the winter, is that quality suppliers will ship either frozen water bottles, frozen ice packs, or heat pads. Now these work for a while, and I'd say 9 out of 10 orders, everything arrived perfectly fine. But there was always the one order where UPS, FedEx, or perhaps even Delta Airlines screwed the pooch and delayed it by a day or two. This normally resulted in catastrophic consequences. The loss of heat or the temperature rising too much causes the coral and subsequent fish and invertebrates to unfortunately die. If you were to order coral online, I highly recommend during the spring and the fall when the temperature is closest to the tank water. That way, if, let's say, FedEx or UPS accidentally misses your package, they have a whole nother day or two before I would become concerned. This has saved me a couple of times when ordering fish. Obviously, you would want to prevent any sort of problem from occurring, but I'm well aware that even the best prevention sometimes doesn't delay the inevitable. Now, I'm going to be going through these reviving steps in order, so if you have a similar problem at home and you're following along, just remember that these are in order. So the first thing that I would do is analyze the coral. What type of coral is it? Is it a large, fleshy, single polyp LPS coral, such as a scolemia or acanthophilia? In which case, you will not be able to cut or saw the bad parts away. If it is a goniopora or alveopora, and there's algae growing on the skeleton, you would want to saw that away. Cutting with bone cutters can sometimes lead to unintentional cuts or shears. I'll show a video of what I mean. When you use bone cutters, it is easy to cut down below your target. However, if you're trying to cut a frog spawn, a torch, or a hammer, or anything similar in skeletal composition, if you try to cut it near where the afflicted area is, it can sometimes shatter the entire skeletal structure, killing the entire colony. That's obviously not good. I'll show another video of me using a diamond-bladed bandsaw. Now, unfortunately, these saws are rather expensive. They range from about $450 to $550. Not exactly what every hobbyist needs. Now, I know that when the customer would bring in a coral that wasn't looking too good, I would always try to help them out at my local fish store, and I would cut it for them using the store's diamond-bladed bandsaw. If you have a local store and you have good relations with them, it's always a great just opportunity to ask them, "Hey, I shop here a lot, we're good friends. Would you mind helping me out and trimming off a piece of this dead coral before it kills the rest of the coral? If you do, and the coral grows, maybe I'll bring some more back in and you can have some of it." That way, both parties win. I would always love that opportunity to help people. Now that both of the videos are done showing, you can really see what I'm talking about. So, for the types of coral that you can cut or saw, it is normally best just to go ahead and get it over with, especially if there's brown jelly, which is a brown or purple substance that is coating the top of one of your large polyp stony corals. A little trick, although it's disgusting, to realize if it's brown jelly is to take it out of the water and give it a good whiff. If you don't like the smell, it's probably brown jelly. But what if you have one of those corals that I mentioned that perhaps you can't cut and you can't saw? Well, that's when we go down the rest of the list. Now, the first thing to do would be to dip the coral. I prefer using the brand Coral RX. I find it to be fairly potent, and it's always served me very well. when reviving coral. I will first dip the coral. I will read the instructions very carefully. On the bottle, it should tell you how much and for how long. After that amount of time, remove it from whatever you are using to dip. I personally have sacrificed a Tupperware container. I fill it up with about half a gallon of water, and that is what I use to dip. Do not ever pour the dip directly into your tank. Once you get the dip coral out, then I recommend putting it underneath a shady area, especially if there is algae growing on the skeleton. This is particularly common for Acanthophilia, Cyanorrhina, and Scalemia. Scalemia usually bounce back pretty quickly, as well as Acanthophilia. Put them under an area that is shaded, and by shaded, I don't mean just low in the tank. I mean where there's literally shade, an overhang, an arch, or you can make something by putting a magnetic fragment on top of it. That way, when you look at the coral, it appears to be in a dark place. This inhibits the algae to grow back onto the skeleton. When you are dealing with Acanthophilia and Scalemia, I highly recommend feeding. I prefer to feed pellets and reefroids and benepets every other day, which means that I'll feed on Monday, I'll feed on Wednesday, and I'll feed on Friday, and then so on and so forth. Do not feed every single day. This can cause stress for your coral, and that's not good. It's already stressed enough. Rinse and repeat this for as long as it takes. For Acanthophilia and Scalemia, it normally takes around 1 to 2 months. It can be a while. So now you're going to be playing the waiting game. After you start to see improvements, you can begin to lessen the feeding. You don't have to feed every other day once you see noticeable improvements. A little while after that, you can begin to bring it back into the light. Just remember, if you see algae starting to grow back onto the skeleton, rinse and repeat by dipping and then putting in a shady area. This will continue to help your coral grow. These corals can sometimes be frustrating to recover, but I find the challenge well worth it, especially when you're dealing with beautiful corals that are so remarkable they have the chance to bounce back from the brink of death. Thank you for joining me on this couchside chat, and I hope to be doing more of these videos with you.